let us begin. So we're recording and we're recording. Okay. This is I did a recording. I apologize for not being able to get here. Just some things came up, and because I wanted to get here to set up the practical early, but I got it early this morning. We had a lot going on with high school kids on campus for Dr. Hannah and I. Nevertheless, this is just, I want to just tell you what I covered. I put the recording up already as I sent you an email, and we'll go from there. And basically what I did was, before I get to that one, it was the A PowerPoint out of this, and really it was mostly the eye anatomy. I think was the vast majority. It was a little bit, I think, finishing up, maybe some stuff from the end of the spinal cord portion. So just as I'm just showing you through these, I'm not going to talk about them, but just to give you an idea of what I covered and what I didn't cover. So everything that was anatomical, we covered to a certain extent without going into a lot of some of the, the palpebral feature and the lateral commissure or medial commissure, don't care about. But the major structures were there. I mean, we know what eyelids and eyebrows are, so you don't have to go crazy over that. But understanding particularly the role of the conjunctiva or conjunctiva, depending how you pronounce it, the lacrimolar apparatus, certainly, and subsequently, we did the eye muscles, the extrinsic, the LR6-SO43 previously, so I skipped those. And really, what I think the focus point for a great deal of it was this: the major structure of the eyeball, the three tunics, what are the nuances, how they distinguish from one another, the important parts like the blind spot, and then the macula lutea, and the fovea centralis, the ciliary muscles, suspensory ligaments, the nature of the lens, the iris, the aqueous humor or the aqueous liquid component anterior to the lens and bordered then posterior by the lens, the border anteriorly by the cornea, and then posteriorly the vitreous. And we have cow's eyes, and next week will be dissection. In the lab, a week from Monday, will be a cow's eye dissection. And I suspect on the following week, which will be the 30th, we will do the heart dissection as well. So we've got a couple of dissections coming up as part of our lab stuff that we're doing. And then by the time we finish with all that, I think the next practical will be maybe the second Monday, like maybe around the 14th, and then we'll have a final one. So because we have three that are incorporated here, and you'll see that those are a little bit different because they're more, they involve illustrations more than they do models or actual bone specimens, which is what we see today. So all that, it's pretty well good to go, and so I'll have the door open at 3 and we can get started. So again, the differences, the nuances of each of the layers are very important. And so I did all of this material, and that basically is, and then we got to this toward the very end. So we do delve a little bit, even though it's sort of just borderlines physiology, we come back to this extensively, relatively early on for most of you lucky ones who will be going into physiology. Oh, what fun! Which is a lot of fun. And so we'll look at the rods and the cones and their shapes being very distinctive, the different cells that are involved, the bipolar cells, the ganglionic cells. Basically, and I do make a comment about this if you go back to it, really a very fascinating area if you hear my little narrative about it. The idea of retinal detachment, the chambers, a little bit about glaucoma was in there as well. And all these things, it's amazing how with modernization, how much we test and are able to do so these days. So I just wanted to give you the sort of the, quick little couple of minute synopsis of what I covered. It was about, I think we ran about 35, 38 minutes, that particular presentation. So before we get to the ear, which is really the next part, because really this initial portion is all having to do with the physiology of vision. We're not going to deal with that since it's physiological in nature. Is we will go on and take a look at really the next set of receptors, which are chemical receptors, and they're intimately tied together. and that's taste and smell. And, vis-a-vis COVID, a lot of people had difficulty with taste and smell. So undoubtedly, some aspect of that infection in certain cases did impact people with regard to this. So these are, but the nature of being chemical, to me, they're a little less anatomical and a little more physiological. And what they involve is you have to have, because of the chemicals have to be dissolved, we're looking at either mucus or saliva being the solvent agents that facilitate these receptors, for olfaction and gustation or taste that are there. So I think that's certainly an important portion of this. So I wanted to touch on it very, very briefly. Uh, as years ago, we didn't think we had quite as many olfactory receptors as we really do, and the numbers have changed over time. And now we feel there's a lot more. I mean, nowhere near as much as, say, an animal's ability to discriminate when you think of like a bloodhound or something like that, or my dog who has the classic poodle nose. I mean, you can't help but hit his nose. Just reach out and touch him. Just saying. And see, none of you are in a mood to appreciate, even tacitly, my feeble attempts at humor. I told her I didn't like you.
That's fine.
No, I didn't.
I was gonna say, you lied to her.
I did lie to her. I do like you. Like, I like everybody. Okay, so olfactory epithelium, they're in the upper portion for the most part. Those little sort of appendages of the sensory portion of the olfactory nerve, penetrating through the cribriform foramina, embedding itself in there. There are supporting cells that are there. Yes, there are stem cells. That's a good thing about both taste and smell. There are a variety of stem cells. So when they're damaged, let's say by if you harshly inhale smoke, or we often say you burn your tongue, when really something, it's rarely permanent in nature. Those come back, just the way other people who lost it temporarily in COVID, for the most part, got it back. And here they are from the bulb itself and the tiny fibers, and they trail down quite a bit. The nerves themselves are mostly bipolar, and the tiny knobs are really where the sensation is that are there. And again, the mucus acts as the solvent, and all of those, basically, that's the receptor portion leading up to the olfactory bulb and then the nerve. So you can see every 30 to 60 days, we keep generating more of these. So it's not something, even if you lose it transiently, you don't lose it permanently. And it's a fairly good illustration to see sort of the bipolar nature of the cells. And then so they don't have those photoreceptor cells. This portion, the dendritic portion of the bipolar cells, are what are embedded in the mucus that are there. And so when you smell something, there's a lot of different components. We have a lot of receptors, but nowadays we're thinking that this number isn't necessarily in the hundreds, but in the thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands. I think we've underestimated a great deal. There's also pain and temperature receptors that are part of it. Again, that's part of the reason why ammonia or spirits of ammonia or smelling salts are so significant that we know. And there's a lot of things that you can pick up quite easily, as we already know. It has, by nature, it has to be volatile, so it has the potential to be at least a portion of it in the gaseous state. It uses that standard G protein. We'll go over that again later on. And again, olfactory adaptation. When you're exposed, it's like being in the lab or in the micro lab where you get all those funky smells. Over time, you go in there and go, oh my goodness. And then after that, you don't notice it as much. That's true in a lot of it. I'm not going to go over that type of thing, or where, so I just wanted to acquaint you with more or less the anatomy of it. And so again, look at these different signs. Now, COVID was the thing, but we can see neurological disorders or Alzheimer's. There's a lot of loss of that. Olfactory hallucinations are sometimes a prodrome or a warning of epilepsy or seizure disorders, this sort of aura. You can go crazy with the anatomy of taste buds, although it's fairly similar. in the sense that it's dissolved in saliva rather than mucus. There's a lot of available thing. You have a lot of taste buds. When you in traditional anatomy and in like medical school graduate levels of anatomy, you do with valate and circumvallate and foliate and fungiform and all that. You have to be able to identify all the different taste buds, and they're more than just what you think. They're all over the cheek, the pharynx, the epiglottis, the palate itself. There's a lot. They're more than what you think. So there's a great deal of it is covered in what we call taste buds. And taste buds are interesting cells in that they have, as you will see, little clefts that increase the surface area. And that's really where the particles that create taste enter. They almost look like a little bit like hair cells, which you will see a little bit now when we get into the ear itself. So these gustatorial epithelial cells, they're really a variation of microvilli called gustatory hairs, because they look a little bit like hair, but they're just in a microvillus appendage, okay, surrounded by the saliva and different, and without going into the physiology there, as you can see, serotonin and ATP actually act as neurotransmitters that are there. And you can see we have stem cells that replace them. So when you do get that unusually hot piece of pizza, see, from the New York metropolitan area, we're pizza folders. That whole knife and fork thing is just, you got to get it out there. It's got to be long. You got to do the fold. And the fold, and sometimes the fold and the flip. You want to do it properly. Every area has its own pizza. Sicilian, Chicago deep dish. And this is what I mean. So here's this sort of valate, which had a little bit of a V kind of a shape. And then you have these little clefts. And then as we enlarge this is where the receptor portion is. So this is what they kind of look like when you look up close and personal. Here's an actual micrograph. These are the hair cells. And you can see basically it's increasing the amount of surface area. And some people have remarkably more taste. The major taste that we're all familiar with: sweet, sour, salt, and bitter. And most of them are on the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And then umami, which is the glutamate where it derives its name, as well as aspartate, are that certain kind of interesting taste that you get from certain factors that are there. Mushrooms have a lot of it. Soy sauce has a lot of it. Worcestershire has a lot of it. Worcestershire, if you don't know, it's derived from anchovies. So things like if you're like me and you like Thai cuisine, we use something called fish sauce, which is one of the major fish sauce, Thai basil, Thai chilies, lemongrass are all things. And not so much lemongrass, but the fish sauce definitely has a distinctive. You don't need a whole lot of it to generate a lot of umami that's there. So they're all, and from a foodie or a cooking perspective, you want to get all these in, because it's like mouth explosion, which is what you want. You want a flavor bomb. When you're cooking, anytime you have a chance to add flavor, you have to add it. So these are all portions of them that are there. Why we say that, using a squeeze of lemon juice because of the sour or the acidity is a brightening agent, even though you wouldn't think so. And salt being part of it, even a certain amount of bitterness that we use with certain kinds of things have. If you're a fan of certain kinds of lettuces, like arugula or romaine, have a nice sort of a bitter offset component. Sooner or later, you'll get into, foodie type of thing. There are a couple of others. Some people have, and they describe this with lipids, with this sort of, they like things that are fatty. I personally don't like that kind of, but there's these days pork belly. There's a lot of enthusiasm for that when people do that and fry. It's very popular. Porchetta fans. That's like pork loin wrapped in pork belly that's seasoned and roasted off. And a variety, and obviously there's certain aspects of it that are usual. And the other one is very, very spicy or hot foods. Some people, they have an immense amount of tolerance. So when you go out for that kind of cuisine, they'll say, how spicy do you want it? 1 to 10. Like, I'm a 1. And my stepson's a 10. He wants it like, 5-alarm fire hot. Everybody's a little bit different with this. So we're not going to get, and again, it's a gustatory cell, neurotransmitters for the most part. That's why for years, if you go back to what they say here, MSG. So for years, when you went out for Asian cuisine, what they did is they put a ton of that in. You could buy it. It was a flavor enhancer called Accent in powder form, and you sprinkled it in. And the trouble was that gave certain people an odd reaction because it's basically a stimulant. They'd get headaches. They'd get very flushed. Those kinds of things. Their heart would race a little bit. So now most of the time you can control that. And particularly if you make it yourself, you don't have nearly that much MSG, and you can lower sodium content. I always use low sodium soy. Sometimes it's just overwhelming. Just say, so a little foodie stuff, and again, facial nerve, again, you'll recall anterior 2/3, glossopharyngeal, posterior third. And a lot of times, like particularly with hot peppers, you'll get it, and they call it the finish. It's the back of the throat. There's certain peppers, chipotles are like that. They got on the epiglottis, they seem to trigger that. Just okay. So you guys weren't enthusiastic about taste, so we're fond of saying good taste is timeless. They're all going to think you're crazy. Nah, they already do think you're crazy. They know you're crazy. Jose, you don't want that. This is okie dokie. Steve, we're doing C. All right, this is the ear portion of the program. So understand that we're looking anatomically at the vestibulocochlear mechanism. Again, that's the 8th cranial nerve, the only nerve that basically it terminates as it enters the internal acoustic meatus. And again, it's 2 nerves wrapped as one. We used to call it the acoustic nerve. Now it's called vestibulocochlear because we know it's 2 independent nerves. So we have to look anatomically at the area that's there. There's not a lot to say about the outer ear. It's an ear. Okay. It terminates at the external acoustic meatus. What covers that is your tympanic membrane, your eardrum. And it's exactly what it is. It's a drum head. Because it's all about pressure changes and vibration. When you're hearing me, whether I'm speaking very loud or very soft, or at certain different tonal qualities, or the distinction is we recognize others' voices. Okay, that's all about vibrating that tympanic membrane. And obviously, when you deal with ear infections and things like that, what happens is there's fluid behind that in the middle ear cavity, which is bounded externally by the tympanic membrane and internally by the entryway called the oval window into the deeper portions, the inner ear, where those mechanisms, where the cochlea and the semicircular canals are located. So that's the boundary. It's translucent. That's why when we look at it diagnostically, you should be able to see a little conical area where light is transmitted. It's like a tiny atomizer, we used to call it, like a little, like when my mom had it for her perfume, you could that thing, and you basically it'll push air against and you should be able to see the vibration. When looking, if it doesn't vibrate, that suggests that there's fluid behind it, not letting the drum function. And indeed, it would hurt a great deal. So we think of an inflamed ear, sometimes called an injected ear. That's where you have. And so its whole job by vibrating is to transfer it to these 3 little bones known as the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrups, or for your purposes, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. So here they are. There's the eardrum, tympanic membrane. There's the hammer, like that. This is the anvil that you're on, and that looked like a pair of stirrups, so hence the name stapes. And it transmits, amplifies, directs the sound toward the entryway to these. This is where you're going to find the oval window. And it will transmit whether it's has to do with changes in head position by way of the semicircular canals or directly into this sort of snail-shaped apparatus called the cochlea, that sort of snail shell. What'll happen, that force and that sound will eventually exit underneath it here by something called the oval window. It's not as though it's trapped in there. It's really tiny. We're talking about these structures are the size of like a split pea. And if you've ever made split pea soup, they ain't big. Okay. It's the only one of the few criticisms I have of my wife. She doesn't fond of split pea soup. I love it. Just. All right. So air-filled, mucus line, oval and round windows on the other side. There's not a whole lot to say after that. The big player here to lower the pressure is the pharyngotympanic or auditory, whatever you want to call it, or eustachian tube. Very, very famous. We'll get into it again in respiratory anatomy. Again, I'm sure I've mentioned it before, that tube is very much, in babies, very much horizontal. As we grow and expand, the tube goes, it's more declinated. And so that's the anatomical basis for why we see infections, ear infections in little kids. Much more so, because by about age 4, it starts to go down. When babies sleep, it's like this. If they sleep on their back, that's draining right back in there against the eardrum. And eventually it inflames the lining and becomes recurrent and chronic. I'm sure somebody here probably had tubes in their ear when they were little. I'm just guessing. My daughter had 2 sets. They end up with their tonsils out. So, I mean, these all come from that start. So there is the name of the tube, flattened, but can be open, equalizing pressure. I mean, sometimes if it's been over time, it does create certain amounts of problems. Like I know that when I fly, it's very, if I'm in a nonstop, it's not a problem. But the minute I have to go down and go back up again, like with a typical connection, it's like, oh my God, my ears are just for days. Okay, and here's the malleus, incus, and stapes. Again, into the oval window, they are synovial joints, regular joints. They articulate with one another. Ligaments suspended, those 2 ligaments that adapt for loudness, particularly when we have our auditory adaptation, are called the tensor tympani and the stapedius. So they're not hard. The names are fairly obvious. Tympani having to do with the tympanic membrane, and the stapedius because of the stapes. So loud sounds, they respond reflexly, so you don't damage the receptors. There's the otitis media nugget. That's there. And now we get into the internal ear. And the internal ear, sometimes referred to as the bony labyrinth, because of its maze-like structure. Not so much Theseus and the Minotaur, labyrinth, but a labyrinth nonetheless. I love mythological. Just always into that. It's amazing how much anatomy has. We have a fair amount. It's like the atlas and the axis. You know, hey, it's mythology. So the bony labyrinth, tortuous channels. It has what we find is an entryway called a vestibule, the semicircular canals, and the cochlea. And they're all filled with a fluid that's a lot similar to cerebrospinal fluid called perilymph. You're going to see that as we get deeper into it, then when we look, what really is the physiological basis has to do a lot with when we get into the membranous portion of this labyrinth, we see potassium-rich endolymph. And what is in there, and it's very similar, again, are what are our hair cells, which are really microvillous things that are embedded. And when they move, those hair cells physiologically, which we're just going to look at, not going to really describe what happens, those cells, those hair cells, when they move, those microvilli appendages, it creates effectively an opening, an entryway for potassium-rich particles to enter. And that's what triggers your ability to hear or to change balance or anything like that. That's where it all comes from. So you'll see, particularly in the hearing side, where the endolymph is. So this is what it looks like. I always use the analogy of the carpenter's level because effectively, this is you and I in basically making our brain aware of our head and neck position and how rapidly it's moving. And some folks adapt to it very well and some cannot. So if I didn't mention to you, I always do. I'm much better driving than I am as a passenger. My wife can sit there and look at her iPad, and she can read in the car. I can't. Like, I'll get car sick right away. It's just, I'm one of those. So I'd rather be driving, and it's worse if I'm sitting in the back. It's just, and a lot of folks are like that. And some it's to the point where it's almost debilitating when they begin to have these kinds of problems. On this side, you have the cochlear aspect of it. So this is the entry point. And if you get more into the anatomy, into the vestibule, the utricle is the entryway into the semicircular canals, and the vestibule, and the saccule rather, is more of the entryway into the cochlear apparatus. So those are two names you might remember. Utricle for semicircular canals, and saccule for the cochlear apparatus that are there. And there's the saccule and the utricle. As you can see, I just described before, specific receptors that respond to different kinds of changes. Semicircular canal, anterior, posterior, and lateral, with membranous ducts that are lined. And then the entryway to each one of these ducts has something called the crista ampullaris. And that has to do with, and you'll see it, there's a very good micrograph and a very good sort of illustration of what it looks like. And when we're moving our head rapidly, or we're moving rapidly, it changes. The cochlea, very tiny ears, that split pea thing again. There's a modiolus, is the bony pillar. It's sort of, remember, it's like that shell shape. It's wrapped around the modiolus that's there. And it houses what we call the spiral organ of Corti. And when you get into the sounds and the physiology of it, depending on where location, we can hear very low sounds or very high-pitched sounds. And that's how we distinguish, depending on where that is. If you would expand, if you took that shell-like structure, roll, sort of jelly roll style, cinnamon bun style. What? Yeah, fruit rolls. I'm with you. Cinnamon roll place over in Beaver Falls. Steady. I always forget the name of that. Worms. Be still, my heart. It's an art form. So if my wife and I drive by there, we have to stop. Doesn't matter. Oh, really?
Yeah.
And one day somebody didn't stop. They drove right in. They went right through on the sidewalk into the bakery. I'm afraid I was going to be late for my cinnamon rolls. So in the cochlea, you're going to see these different stripes. This is kind of what it looks like. So here we are looking at these three different areas, okay, that are there. And so what you're going to see as we look at, this is kind of the blow-up model, which is really good. In these three containers, below and above, what they call the scala tympani and the scala vestibule, you don't have to know the names, is perilymph. This is the big player. The cochlear duct per se, and what's called the scala media. That has the endolymph. That's where the potassium particles are coming from. Right? Did I mention you don't have children? You're running a ship, a destroyer. Why are you calling me at 1:30 in the afternoon? What else has he got to do?
He just wants to chat.
I know. We're going to go see him in December.
Okay. Well,
You want to come?
sure. When in December?
Finals week, that area, right toward the end of finals week.
Is our final the last day? Or is it not?
I have to look.
Okay.
It's either Thursday or Friday. Yeah.
Oh.
Maybe it is.
Well, Simon's not going to be here for it because he's got elective, so it's the 13th.
It is the third, so it's the Wednesday. That's good. And my guess is it's probably going to be Blackboard, so I don't feel like being here,
Oh, you're doing the finals on Blackboard?
most likely.
Okay, sounds good.
You are such a good human, Stein.
Thank you.
You're watching that.
What?
Where's he stationed at?
Mayport Beach, which is Jacksonville. It's not hard when your backyard is the ocean. I have grandchildren who will have no idea what it's not like to be with the ocean. And at the end of the school year, they're going to be moving. Who will be back to Pentagon?
They'll be back here.
Pentagon.
Oh, okay.
Puzzle Palace. World's largest office building. And it is. It's unbelievable how big that sucker is. Moving on. So in here is the endolymph. And you can see two membranes that are really important for you. This is really the area of the spiral organ more than anything else. You have cells here called inner hair cells and here outer hair cells. They're embedded in something called the tectorial membrane. They sit on top of something called the basilar membrane. When sound travels through, okay, it is able to move that basilar membrane. And when it does so, the tectorial membrane doesn't move and the hair cells are embedded in it. So when it moves, depending on whether it moves inside or outside or how rapidly, that's what creates the signal that you and I call hearing. And we'll get into that when we do the physiology of it. So this is that media is the important part. There's vascular structures, etc. So you have inner and outer hair cells, which you'll see are really just a variation of microvilli that are between the tectorial and basilar membranes. Okay, and so this is a good look at what's happening. So you have actually inner hair cells, a variety of supporting cells, and outer hair cells. That's what it looks like micrographically. So sound is really what happens. It travels relatively slowly, and it's a pressure disturbance, and we'll get into all of that and what they do and all this kind of stuff that goes on. For now, there's not a whole lot else to say about this. Again, I think we deal with it more physiologically. The comment I will make, amplitude is based on frequency. When it comes to the nervous system, whether it's loud, whether it's hot, whether it hurts, it's all a matter of how frequent the signal is. If it's a pain fiber, it's like, if it's just, it's a little uncomfortable, then it's very, very low frequency. If it hurts like blazes, or it burns tremendously, that's a very, very frequent signal. So soft is this. Loud is when it comes to the ear. When it comes to pain, when it comes to temperature, when it comes to something visual. Frequency is how we convert that to amplitude. So as you can see, and the measure is decibels. Okay, so normally we're around 50, pain about here, but if you sustain it at high levels. So, and what had happened years ago, we didn't know that sustained at high levels for long periods of time would eventually damage or destroy hearing. And it happened, and now, originally when rock music came out, you had these monstrous amplifiers on stage. Nobody wore protective ear gear or anything like that. It's not like going in the airport and they will have ear protection. And so there were a lot of people in the rock industry, most notable of these, surely, okay, was the creative voice of The Who, Pete Townsend, okay, who basically lost his hearing. He couldn't perform over 90 dBs. They had to change everything because of it, because they were as loud could be. Everybody was into loud. So, and without getting, again, this is more physiology. I just wanted to give you a sort of a heads up, okay? And a variety of if they're near the oval window, it's more high frequency. If they're farther away, it's lower frequency with regard to this process. And they spend a lot of time into it. Effectively, what happens when these hairs are enmeshed in the tectorial membrane, when they move, bending of them causes potassium and calcium basically to trigger and release the neurotransmitter, which typically is glutamate, and cause that. Okay, and so there's depolarization and hyperpolarization, depending, and we'll look at this down in the physiology aspect of it. The outer hair cells are they're basically where the inner ones are afferent, bringing the sound in. The outer ones are more making adjustments. Okay, they fine tune. It's like you hear something, you'll be driving, you'll hear a siren in the distance. You'll sort of strain to see where is it behind me? Is it coming from the side? Is it coming from in front of me? That's this fine tuning. Okay, and the same way, louder noises, they can make subtle adjustments in the tension so we can tolerate them a little bit better. It's like, again, it's like my dog. And the balance aspect of things, not a whole lot different. This is his response. Okay, I guess it's not a class on multitasking. I get,
That's funny.
why am I being treated so disrespectful?
You literally declined your son's phone calls.
Yes.
Stop being dramatic. You're okay. Like, I feel like you started the disrespect.
Wait,
No, no, no.
that's terrible.
No, no, no.
I said I was in class. He knows. All of a sudden, he's in the middle of naval maneuvers, and I call him. I expect him to pick up. Yeah, Dad, what do you need?
Well, hey,
I'm in the middle of the ship. Might run into another ship, but just let me know.
listen, he managed, wow, steering a naval ship to call.
He doesn't steer squat. He sits in a big chair and gives orders.
Isn't that what you're doing right now?
No, I'm teaching. I'm not giving you orders. I'm giving you information to process. No, it's not. Bless you.
God bless you.
I'm telling class and multitask. What a pain in. As I've said, don't have children. So the balance apparatus is really continually monitoring your head position, okay, and monitoring where the head is in space, postural changes, responding. Now, understand that the macular area that they describe is more about acceleration, going faster, going slower, where that you're going to see that apparatus that's in for rotational is a little bit different. So hair cells, again, in this macular area that are there. And what you're going to see, they're embedded in a membrane that's got otoliths. When you see the term lith, it means stone. And you'll see the illustration. So this has a lot to do with inertia. So the idea of going forward or going backward. And you'll be able to see that. So that's how they respond to position. I'll show you the illustration. That's what it kind of looks like inside this macular area. Here's the membrane, the otolithic membrane. Here are the otoliths. These are these hair cells that are embedded, and it depends on whether they toggle forward or backward, telling you what your force of acceleration or deceleration is. And some people, like astronauts and flyers of jet aircraft, like combat jets, they have to be able to tolerate a tremendous amount of gravitational changes and G-forces, not so easy, that are there. And they cause changes in the amount of neurotransmitter released. So all of those things. So, and there's a fair amount that goes on with it. So bending, so if it's bending it in the direction of what they call the kinocilia versus away, okay, this is how your brain is being informed by head. And you can see what it's doing. When it's bent forward or it's being bent backward, we're involved with those gravitational forces. Rotation is this tiny elevation at the entryway into the canal. Okay, and you'll take a look. This is what it looks like anatomically. So here's this entry point to each one of these canals. This is this crista ambularis. This is the actual microgram. You can see what it looks like. And again, it depends on rotation. So they have a really good illustration, and that's what it is. Normally versus the endolymph flowing in one direction or the other direction. So if you've ever seen somebody, if you see somebody doing a spin on skates, when their arms are out, it slows them down. When their arms come in, it accelerates them. And I mean, every day for 7 years, I was at a skating rink at 4:30 in the morning. My daughter was a figure skater. She ended her career skating here before Robert Morris did that. So she's some fairly high levels with that. It's just, I couldn't imagine doing that stuff, because I love to watch the standing spins and the sit spins, and because they're very entertaining. The camel spins, which your arms and legs are extended. Spent a lot of times, and here's the nystagmus component, these eye movements that some people get when they experience vertigo. And again, I'm not going to go into all this. A little bit about, there's a distinction between mechanical blockages or fluid blockages, whether it's earwax or a damaged eardrum with scar tissue or problems with regard to the bones themselves. That's called conduction deafness, versus actual nerve damage, which is neural deafness. And neural deafness is a lot. Typically you treat both these with amplification, different thing. And we made a lot of dramatic improvements in hearing aid technology that are there. So here it's a little bit different. The cochlear implants have really changed lives when they've been successful. Not always successful. Like I said, that Pete Townsend had a cochlear implant, so he's able to hear now. I mean, how effectively this is a very annoying thing. If you've ever gotten it, it's called tinnitus or tinnitus, depending on who pronounces it. Most people pronounce it tinnitus. It is associated with all of these things. There are certain medications. Some people are aspirin freaks, and it can produce this, and it won't go away. It gets bad enough. Quinine alkaloids did the same thing. There were a lot of people who take quinine pills would have this problem as well. It's very annoying. With my wife's trigeminal neuralgia, every so often she'll get a jolt of this, and it's very, very unpleasant. This persistent ringing in your ears, and it's extraordinarily annoying. And if I haven't told you, I'll tell you this at least twice. This is an autoimmune disorder that affects this system. It's called Meniere's disease. And Meniere's disease is a labyrinthal disorder that affects both the cochlea and the semicircular canals, all of these things. And it's a life changer. It's absolutely a life changer. I have seen somebody in a matter of months to a year totally change, because we had very, very limited treatments back in the day. All they had was steroids. And this one gal who was just strikingly attractive. The story was that we wanted to have a June wedding with my first wife. She got the last June date. We saw her at different kinds of weddings, bar mitzvahs, because it was sort of an extended family member on the other, not related directly, but indirectly. And I mean, one year we saw her at a bar mitzvah, and about a year and a half later, there was another bar mitzvah. They had children very, very close together. And it was like a different person. She'd got Meniere's disease. They had to treat with steroids. Unrecognizable. Couldn't walk anymore. Wheelchaired in, gained a ton of weight because steroids did that to people. We'll see about it when we look at endocrine. It was almost overwhelming to see the change from this Meniere's syndrome. And my first wife's aunt had this as well. That was really a problem. So to me, it's a very interesting disorder. We will stop here. And the only thing we have left to do in this chapter, having already done the cranial nerve portion, is just to look at the peripheral nerves that come out of the nerve plexes. And we're done with that. So we'll be able to, on Wednesday, complete that and start the heart. Thank you.
What time does the
We should be starting at 3. Yeah, I have everything set up now. It's ready to go.
And what's the format of the quiz? Is it like
Is that practical?
spelling?
No, I don't worry about spelling. You'll be
Is it
happy.
like